Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome as you come in. Welcome to those of you coming in now. We'll get started in about 1 to 2 minutes maximum.
There's that light there.
We'll start in 1 minute. Okay, welcome everybody. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It is our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however infinitesimal, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. I want to welcome you all to the very first event of the USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice for the fall semester 2020, which is among the most interesting and exciting semesters. Certainly not what any of us imagine, but we are very happy to have you join us in this remote environment where tonight Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb will discuss Teshuvah and reparations in Jewish traditions. My name is Oren Kroll-Zeldin, and I am the interim director of the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. I want to begin by thanking the SWIG JSSJ faculty and staff, as well as the Department of Theology and Religious Studies for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I'd like to take a brief moment to tell you about the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice before we move on. Founded in 1977, our program is the first Jewish Studies chair or program at a Catholic university anywhere in the world. In 2008, we were reestablished as the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the first academic program worldwide to formally link Jewish studies with social justice. Including a minor in this field, in the classroom, the JSSJ program offers a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer extraordinary events that are always free and open to the public, such as tonight's event. Let me tell you about 3 other events that we're having this semester, all of which deal with varying responses to racial injustice. And just like tonight's event, they will all be virtual webinars. On September 23rd, next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m., we have an event called Other Together, a Black Jewish perspective on fighting racism and anti-Semitism, with local San Francisco-based Black Jewish activist and filmmaker Rebecca Pierce. On October 8th at 6:30, the event is called White and Jewish on the Way to Racial Justice. In this event, Rabbi Amy Eilberg will present sacred texts from the Jewish tradition that inspire deep engagement with issues of racial justice and of personal transformation. Finally, on October 21st, also at 6:30, the event is called Racism, Anti-Semitism, and Israel-Palestine. In this event, Dr. Clarence Jones will address the very important topic of the title of his lecture in the 6th annual JSSJ Human Rights Lecture. We hope that you will be able to join us for some or all of these events. Through the SWIG JSSJ program, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, or some other social identity altogether. Before I introduce my colleague, Rabbi Angel, who will introduce our speaker, let me explain briefly how this will work. Tonight, Rabbi Gottlieb will speak, and you'll see you have the opportunity to ask questions by chatting them in the Q&A box on the bottom right of your screen. I think it's on the bottom right of your screen. It's at least on the bottom right of my screen. And we will then, after Rabbi Gottlieb speaks, we will ask the questions and anything you want to add throughout the course of the evening in terms of a comment or question, please feel free to put it into that Q&A box. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Rabbi Camille Angel, who will formally introduce tonight's speaker. Rabbi Angel.
Thank you, Oren. It's my honor and privilege to be part of this cutting edge program, as well as to be serving as the university's full-time, starting my second year campus rabbi. Situated in the University Ministry Office, I'm available to you individually as well as for conversation and classes, and in particular LGBTQ pastoral care. In just a few days, this coming Friday, as the sun sets, we will begin a new Jewish year celebrating the days of awe with Rosh Hashanah. The symbol of the shofar and the blast of the tekiah calls us to awaken ourselves to the work of repair. We wish each other a Shana Tova, and by this we mean, may it be a time of positive change for the good, a good change, a Shana Tova. With so much weighing on our lives these difficult days, we long to see the changes that will diminish the suffering, the inequities and injustices of our society. For hope and inspiration, Jews turn to texts and to text people. So it is this evening. Lynn Gottlieb, one of the first women to become a rabbi in Jewish history, is a pioneer Jewish feminist, peace activist, writer, visual artist, ceremonialist, community educator, organizer, and master storyteller. Lynn has been a congregational rabbi since the fall of 1973 and is founder of Congregation Nahalat Shalom in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1980. Since 1964, Lynn has engaged in multi-faith, intergenerational, and multicultural organizing around issues of economic, racial, indigenous, and queer and gender justice and Palestine solidarity. She was lead staff and program designer of Interfaith Inventions, Wilderness Peace Camp, co-founder of Interfaith Peace Builders, now Eyewitness Palestine in 1998, and co-founder of the Community of Living Traditions at Stony Point Center in New York in 2009, and the Muslim Jewish Peace Walk in 2002. Currently, Lynn serves as Director of Youth and Family Programming at Chokhmat Halev and is author of Peace Primer 2, She Who Dwells Within, a Feminist Vision of Renewed Judaism, and World Beyond Borders Passover Haggadah. She serves as board chair of Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity and as organizer for a grassroots reparations campaign. Rabbi Lynn is a Shomeret Shalom, a practitioner of the Torah of nonviolence. On a personal note, this is a professional thrill to be able to host Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb. I was just a young woman, not even yet a teenager, when you were on the cover of Lilith magazine and the headline read, "Why is the Jewish Theological Seminary afraid of this woman?" You dared to resist and insist a more fair, more just way, and paved the path for me and so many others later to pursue our rabbinic ordination. Tonight's event is a soft launch, if you will, an inaugural event for a new campus organization, Jews for Justice. You'll be hearing more about this group later in the year, but Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, suffice it to say, you are a quintessential Jew for justice. I want to quote from the foreword of She Who Dwells Within, a feminist vision of a renewed Judaism. My teacher, Professor Ellen Umansky, who taught me over 25 years ago, wrote your foreword. And of you, she aptly wrote, "Lynn is a symbol of Jewish feminism and of women's increasing demands for equal access within American Jewish community. Lynn has tapped the spiritual potential of American Jews and has created a non-sexist, ecologically responsible Jewish peace culture that welcomes into its midst all who seek to become members." Your childhood friend and our colleague here at USF, Professor Susan Katz, introduced herself to me last year. "Do you know Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb?" She went on to tell me that before there were any women rabbis, your childhood rabbi recognized this as your natural calling. And my colleague Andrew Raymer, who teaches in our program, is just one of countless Jewish teachers who credit their return to Judaism to your work and your welcome of the feminine divine presence within Judaism. Thank you for your persistence in pursuing social justice and being among our most honored elders. This evening, you'll speak to us on the topic of Teshuvah and reparations. You will explore the application of this ancient healing practice to the wounds generated by the transatlantic slave trade and the ongoing systemic harms of white supremacy. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb.
Thank you so much. Oh my. I am going to begin by introducing myself in a traditional fashion. My name is Miriam Bat Sivia, Bat Bessie, Bat Delia, Bat Jenny, Bat Henrietta, who arrived on Turtle Island in 1839 as a free person. These are my ancestors here on Turtle Island on the United States. And I want to honor their journey that brought me here. In addition, I wish to say a Shomeret Shalom blessing for walking a peace path, for being on a peace pilgrimage. And to walk this pilgrimage is to walk in search of justice. And I would like you to think about who you would like to dedicate this learning to tonight. Who are the ancestors that you and teachers that you are thinking about that brought you to this occasion? You can write it down if you have a pencil and paper so that you have a note of what you're thinking of tonight. And I will say, Bruchaya Shechina Hamechina Mitzadeh Shalom. Blessed is the spirit of life, which prepares the way of peace. I also dedicate this learning in the spirit of urgent solidarity, that our study leads to action that transforms this world into a house of peaceful sanctuary for all living beings across all bars and borders. This is the season of atonement for public sins. And as we prepare to enter the threshold of the new year, truly we are standing before the high waters, a sea of chaos, pandemic, and fire. The very air we breathe is poisonous, and the danger to life and the need for global atonement has never felt stronger. And in this moment, I recall a story that I had the great honor to tell in Iran, where this story was first told to a community of Jewish people in Tehran, who I went to visit as part of an interfaith peace delegation. And this story of Serach Bat Asher, the person who left Palestine, left Eretz Israel, left the land of Canaan to live through the oppression in Mitzrayim, in the empire of Pharaoh. She once appeared as Iranian rabbis were sitting, Talmudic rabbis were sitting among themselves and asking the question, when we stood before the parting sea, how did it part? Was it one lane? Was it 3 different lanes? Was it 12 lanes for each of the tribes? And Serach came and said, it wasn't like that. When our people rose up against the empire and fled west in search of freedom and stood before the high waters, stunned by fear, the prophet Miriam took the drum in her hand, and all the drummers went with her. In call and response, they sang, our song is rolling thunder, parting the sea, delivering us to freedom. And the sea parted, and we sang our song through the perilous waters. And as we walked, we saw on one side the face of all our ancestors that came before us, mirrored in the waters. And on the other side, we saw all the generations that would come from this freedom journey, mirrored on the other side. And Serach said, in each generation, we carry that vision of those who came before and those who will come after, knowing that their well-being is in our hands and our capacity to bring our wisdom with us to the next generation. It is in our hands to go through these perilous waters and to create a Torah of mutual support, a Torah based on principles of human dignity and love your neighbor as yourself, a global Torah grounded in universal principles of human rights that honors our diversity, our resiliency, our sustainability. And we know that history is its own witness. So before we think about Teshuvah, and before we enter this process and use the medicine of Teshuvah, which our ancestors gave us to heal wounds born of long-standing collective sins that arise when we treat some people as disposable, not worthy of life, bereft of basic human rights, denied resources, and dignity. We remember that our Torah teaches us, the divine says, I am with them in distress. This is the measure of our repentance and repair. So as we take spiritual inventory and we ask, how is the health of my heart, my relationships, and the world I live in? We remember that we judge well-being by the cry of those whose suffering continues to go unanswered and is not relieved. Teshuvah and reparations grows out of the prophetic mode of Jewish tradition, this mode of interrogating life that questions the assumptions and norms of those who hold privilege. All things, all the mitzvahs, all our protocols, all our stories are to be measured in the mirror of injustice and justice. Who is living and who is dying? This is the question. Teshuvah is then a public and systemic inventory. And we know this from another story, which links the blowing of the shofar at the conclusion of Yom Kippur to the emancipated of the enslaved. As another pacifist rabbi who was translated by my teacher, Rabbi Everett Gendler, this rabbi, Rabbi Samuel Tamaris, writes that this moment of blowing the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur is associated with the most exalted of biblical events, the giving of the Torah, which are the protocols of the beloved community, and the day of emancipation of the enslaved. The shofar is an instrument whose very sound plants within the human heart a passion for truth and healing justice. So we understand the Teshuvah of reparations from this perspective as an act of solidarity, a recognition that healing is a movement building endeavor. And so we should know where we stand in this. And if we make a flower with ourselves in the middle and 8 petals, and we put race, class, ability, religion, citizenship status, gender, national origin, and sexual orientation, we can see where we hold privilege and where our identities are targeted. Today, I explore Teshuvah as reparations through the lens of the ongoing harms of anti-Blackness as it was expressed in the transatlantic slave trade and is still ongoing, in which I am implicated as a white Ashkenazi Jew. This does not mean that white supremacy does not harm Jews, but today, or indigenous people, or trans and queer people. Today, we are focusing on how Teshuvah can work in the context of healing through reparations around the sins of anti-Blackness. And we can apply these to other acts of reparations. So these are the 5 steps. Number 1, hakarat hachet, awareness of the suffering caused by injustice. And this requires cultivating empathy for the injured party. In this first step, we allow ourselves to feel our broken hearts due to our awareness of the toll of suffering that Black people carry because of anti-Blackness in the United States. We educate ourselves about the root causes of suffering and the way we hold privilege. And we awaken compassion in our hearts so we can bear the feelings we are going to feel when we confront this terrible sin. We open our hearts to lament, we light a candle, we fast, we sit in silence, we return to our breath, we heal through our connection to nature so that we can sustain the work of the next 4 steps. If we carry an identity of being the disposable one, then we have also to open compassion, our hearts to compassion, and to reaffirm the wholeness of our being. Healing involves a lot of inner barriers that people have to get through, various stages of denial and guilt. We may find ourselves going through several stages of denial. It's hard to change the pathways of the mind in a normative racist society. But if we open and are humble and are listening and keep going through this cyclical process, then Teshuvah is a healing process, and that is a source of joy. The second is harata, feeling accountable for these injuries, feeling our part in it. We acknowledge our part in systems of harm articulated by those directly impacted by harm. And to do that, we have to uncover our own histories. We have to track our historical relationship, the land we sit upon, where our ancestors came from, how we have been able to inherit wealth because of our skin privilege, or not because of our skin privilege. We have to sort of unpack all of that. And in this Teshuvah as reparations, this process of accountability was always considered very serious, to the extent that even in Mishnaic times, ashes were put on the ark, and the ark was taken to a public square. Ashes were put on the heads of government officials like mayors and religious authorities and everyone present. And the elder would speak tochacha, words of direct communication of what is wrong, and say, rend your heart, not your clothes. And Rashi and Masechet Ta'anit said, this included a thorough examination of witnesses to look into the dealings of people of the city. And if they have stolen, if there is theft or violence between them. And certainly we understand the harms of anti-Blackness as the utter looting of the bodies and resources, land, culture, well-being of Black people. And so again, Teshuvah really applies. And then there is the accountability by naming these harms. And we either make a fist or beat your chest, and we say, for the sin of racism, for the sin of anti-Blackness, for the sins of patriarchy and gender violence that generated transatlantic slavery, for the sin of colonial settlerism, for the sins of white supremacy, for the sins of forced land appropriation, for the sins of polluting sacred waters, for the sins of genocide, for the sins of profiting from violence, for the sins of mass incarceration and criminalization, for the sins of labor exploitation, for the sins of separating families and stealing children, for the sins of caging and torturing children, for the sins of forced sterilization, medical experimentation on incarcerated populations, for the sins of condemning people to death by not freeing them from prison, for the sins of building walls, for the sins of climate chaos and environmental injustice, for the sins of policing and militarization of land and life, for the sins of neglect in every area of American life based on the caste system of anti-Blackness, for the sins of privilege which consumes without limits, for the sins of erasing culture and not honoring cultures from which we gain wisdom. For all these sins, Avinu Malkeinu, Salach lanu, Machal lanu, Kaper lanu. So this is the naming, and yet there is more. The vidui. We must listen, gain wisdom and tactics from the testimony of those most harmed. This is the vidui, the Teshuvah of reparations. And I'm reminded in thinking about this of Frederick Douglass's July 5th, What Due to the Slaves is the 4th of July, in which he points out that the rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your ancestors is shared by you, not by me, he said. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the ground, illuminated temple of liberty, and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhumane mockery and sacrilegious irony. So, truth-telling by Black people in the context of our Teshuvah is critical to an honest and authentic process. We cannot move forward without this. And for me, as a Shomeret Shalom, this has meant being a woman of pilgrimage. From Beit Sahur to Standing Rock, from incarcerated spaces to Sabra and Shatila, from farm workers in the field to Guapinol in Honduras, to the Mosque of Malcolm X, to Attica, to Harlem, to mosques and synagogues in Iran, to Ferguson, to all spaces and places where Black people are telling their stories and struggling for freedom, and where all people struggle. This is what the pilgrimage of reparations looks like, because we cannot know how we should act unless we are listening profoundly and deeply. And then comes Pe'era'on. And this is really where Teshuvah often fails. It does not give reparations. It goes through a kind of symbolic recognition, but reparations aren't given. Reparations actually means that the nation is asking for forgiveness for the sin of slavery. Even so, we acknowledge there is no real way to repair what has happened. The nation can never take back its original sin, it's part of history, and the crime against Black people. Reparations, therefore, is not just about remembering the past, naming the harms, or even attempting to mend the present. It is about the future, creating a different future. And therefore, reparations, as an invitation to be forgiven, must include the recognition that the financial compensation itself comes from all the extracting that has been done from communities on the edges, extraction that continues to haunt and harass those communities to this very day. Reparations depends on creating new relationships that do not continue to demean, dominate, destroy, or neglect. Therefore, reparations must include restoration of rights, property, citizenship status, and voter rights. It must include rehabilitation, both psychological and with psychological and physical support, with appropriate mental health opportunities and healing and birthright for Black mothers. It must include compensation, not just transactional compensation, but creating reparative relationships that will involve a transfer of wealth. It must involve satisfaction, acknowledgement of the guilt, apology, all the appropriate memorials, and the changing of the landscape so that it reflects history's reality. And finally, reparations must have guarantees of non-repeat, azivat achet. And this means that there is systemic change. The world we want to see is happening. That restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction has been carried out, is being carried out in ways that are measurable, and that there is non-repeat. That means that reparations teshuvah represents the altering of our power relationships and reimagining how to organize society. Reparations is intersectional, creative, multifaceted, diverse, and works across multiple identities and is interdisciplinary. Because racism is an avoidable impairment. It's avoidable. It does not have to be. And so there is hope in being able to reimagine and recreate our relationships in ways that transform how we live in the world and how future generations will live in the world. Olam Chesed Yibanez, people like to sing, we can build a world based on love. May this world, which requires much of us, be for the sake of our children. And I say, thank you and amen. The rabbi always says amen. That's just the nature of it. And so I am ready for questions.
I'm ready to field questions.
Or responses, however you.
I took notes. I feel like I felt like I'm a student, and anyway, it was, it's rich. Here's one. Let's see. In today's racial climate, what role can Jews and allies play in ensuring reparations become a reality?
By doing the work, actually. One has to do the work, and it begins with taking inventory of oneself and one's place in the world, and then looking to see what Black-led organizations are in your world, in your domain, whether you're in the university or perhaps it's around your city, and then joining those efforts. So the main principle of reparations, as it is defined by the Black community, is to continue to emphasize that centering the experiential wisdom, life story, and tactics of the Black community and Black-led organizations is how we can be allies in that effort. Now that is going to include taking care of our own situation of racism in our own community, which I know Rebecca Pierce will address. And I know that it has been addressed somewhat recently, that the acknowledgement that 20% of the Jewish community are people of color, and that even within the last 5 years, there's been really an amazing growth of Black-led Jewish organizations in the United States. Knowing, answering the call that was recently made called, let's see, it was called Do Not Desist, I think, or something like that. It's responsive, being responsive. The Black community has created a lot of amazing platforms and portals for people to actually transfer wealth, including a portal, www.reparations for the number 4 slavery.org, I think, where you can make reparations online. So the question really is finding a good chavruta, so you can be together, and supporting, learning about support and about Black-led organizations that are engaged in reparations, whether it's in housing or healthcare or education. There's ample opportunity. Certainly policing, dealing with policing is very high up in the concern in this moment.
Thank you. Here's the next question. You mentioned being a person of witness and talked about all kinds of things like Standing Rock and Ferguson, for example. What did you learn from your experiences being there, and what lessons can we learn from your experience in those radical activist spaces?
I grew up in a privileged context, and I understood very early on from seeing photos of terrible photos of the Holocaust. You know, and this is before Holocaust education was in the United States. I'm talking about the early 60s. And then listening to survivors in my own community, I realized that the world was not, the world of suffering is great. And that rabbis of my youth who were deeply involved in civil rights taught me that never again means never again for anybody. I think we've lost that, actually. We're coming back to it. It's coming back around, but that sense of solidarity, of faithful solidarity that I learned from my teachers kind of lessened as Israeli militarism and sort of statehood overtook a very traditional view of solidarity. So by going to places like Beit Tzahor, like Palestine, which I've been to 20 times, or Sabra and Shatila, and listening to what people have to say and being treated so hospitably. That is another piece that's truly radicalizing, to the radical hospitality of the communities that I visited. It's just taught me incredible humility as I think about how I can contribute and what it means to contribute. Those spaces, if one goes not to pat oneself on the shoulder where, you know, this is where I've been, but to really learn the impact of suffering, the impact of actions, you know, that is a very humbling experience. And as I learned from Atala Mansour, one of the first Palestinians, this is 1966, whose home I visited, and when I was asking him about his story, which I realize is pretty unusual for a 17-year-old Jewish kid who went to Bethlehem to seek out Palestinian voices, that had everything to do with my awareness of the struggle for human rights by Black people in the United States. He said to me, if I tell you my story, which I knew was not going to reconcile with the stories that I heard as a Jewish kid about Israel in Haifa by Israeli Jews. He told me, if I tell you my story, you're going to be accountable for this story. Like, I'm not just going to tell it to you. It's not going to be, I don't want you to feel because you've heard it somehow you can participate in that way. No, it means that you are accountable for doing something about it. That was a lesson I got in 1966. And it has always guided my journey to try to do what I can to repair harm.
Thank you. What can we do to help our friends and family take the next step from being passive supporters of reparations or of the Black Lives Matter movement into active participants? Can we participate towards reparations without being active participants in the movement?
Let 10,000 flowers bloom. There are so many ways to participate. There can be transfer of wealth, you know, giving more, finding, if you are the one who feels like you want to be active, you can be a model, and then you can provide access and opportunity to people who might not be as active as you. This has certainly been part of my life. You know, I just organized a virtual run for Gaza, for instance, and we raised $2,700 so that refugee kids could be fed in the camps. There are so many reparation platforms. There are so many local groups you can support. You can do a house party and invite your relatives to a virtual house party. You can raise funds. You can have a speaker, you know, do that education piece. You can invite them to listen to Rebecca. There's just so many ways. And I think that people, if you keep walking, as the Kusker Rebbe says, you know, halacha, it's about, you take the next step, you take the next step, you take the next step. You don't have to do it all at once, as Rabbi Tarfon teaches us, but you just keep doing what you can do. And there's always more that you can do, I have found.
This builds on that. What advice do you have for those of us who are students on how to make positive social change when we are burdened with school and work and student loans and catastrophic economic conditions?
Take a breath. Healing oneself and having a healing practice is really important for all of this. One cannot continue to sustain these works without a healing practice. You have to keep breathing, eating right, trying to, get good sleep, taking care of your studies and doing what you can. And in that sense of spaciousness, you may find something that you can do. And rather than thinking of was sort of wall of overwhelm, which often is a form of denial, really. It's one of those things that stops us. Take in that breath and organize your time, and then figure out what you have spaciousness to do as a form of tzedakah, as a form of your spiritual giveaway. And that spiritual giveaway is actually a very joyous thing. It doesn't have to feel like a burden. It can feel like a beautiful moment of giveaway. That too is part of our tradition. Even if it's putting that tzedakah box on your Friday night table, if that is your practice, and dropping it in there, or passing on, or in your educational search. There's so many opportunities. Oh my goodness. Education is an opportunity to deepen your learning. And finding good mentors and good support for what you're doing, such as Rabbi Angel and Oren, and the people around you, that reaching out to people who can help sustain you and help you ask for what you need, that's a good thing.
We have one more question. These are really great questions, and your answers are really enriching. Is it possible for reparations to actually happen on a widespread level in the United States? Is it politically viable, or just some lofty left-wing goal?
This goal does not come from the left wing. This goal was requested by Black people, and it is owed Black people since the end of the Civil War. It may be lofty, but it is the only way to heal the sickness of this nation. Lofty is not bad. Lofty is something that we aspire to. We have to have a vision of the world we want to live in. And then each of us has to do what we can. For instance, taking 5 minutes to support House Bill 40 from committee to the floor, voting. Everybody be voting. You better be voting. And creating supporting the movement that is already happening. This is not lofty, it is ground. It is the ground floor. Reparations is the ground floor. And you can do this individually on a grassroots level by going to grassroots reparations campaign, www. I think it's reparations campaign, but it's a grassroots reparation campaign. And you can begin to make those reparations through yourself and your family, through transfer of wealth to Black-led organizations. That's true. And on a national level, things rise from the bottom. They rise from the bottom. So don't think of it as lofty. Think of it as all of us blowing the winds of change in the right direction. That is what will happen. If you go like this, if you touch the screen, know that all of us, it's going to take all of us, each in our own way, to make this happen. But we don't have a choice. We can't say, oh, this is some loft. No, this is what we're being asked to do. This is what we're accountable for. We have to do this. Those of us living in the fires understand that when we fail to act, what happens? You know, we don't have a choice, but therefore it is the possibility of reparations and change. And certainly I feel like I have those on an interpersonal level. I'm just so honored for the people like Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, which is a people of color-led organization, or the Grassroots Reparation Campaign, which is a Black-led organization, to be invited to be an ally there. As my friend Dave Ragland says, you know, a white translator. These are very special relationships, and deeply spiritual and deeply moving and deeply hopeful. So take the next step. Take the next step and contribute to the change. That is the meaning of Teshuvah and reparations.
Rabbi Lynn, we have a couple more questions. Someone just wrote in, I'm struggling with the idea of voting as a means to support Black liberation. I feel like we cannot elect and legislate away oppression. How do you think that participating in electoral politics aligns with contributions to help African Americans? If death doesn't push politicians left, then what can?
I mean, again, listening to William Barber, for instance, or all the Black people that I know that I'm involved in my circles, they're all saying vote, because it's not just voting at the top, it's voting in the city councils, and it's also having access to voting. I mean, people gave their lives for this, and it's being taken away. And voting can change things. That's one part of it, is power. Like the election of Cori Bush, for instance, out of Ferguson, you know, these are transformative moments, and they have possibility. And you know, the suppression of the vote is done to poor people across the board. Taking away the opportunity to vote is criminal. It's a criminal act. And it is not the only thing that will change. Certainly we have to change narratives, we have to change relationships, we have to change the distribution of resources, so many things, but voting is the way that we can exercise power. And we are being asked to vote. So it's not that much of a struggle to just, you know, sign your name and send it in the mail in California. It's an act of hope. It's one more act of resistance to fascism. It's not the only thing, but it is something important.
Can you talk a little bit about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions or something in addition to reparations?
Well, that's why I'm talking about Teshuvah, because Teshuvah is a 5-step process. You cannot, reconciliation is the promise at the end of the road. And unless, as was clear from many of the 72 Truth and Reconciliation efforts that came out of South Africa, you know, and spread throughout the world, the biggest setback was that it ended up being symbolic and not actually, did not deal with systemic change in terms of the infrastructure, which in this country would include abolition, the work of abolition, and reparations. So you know, you could think of Teshuvah as the whole 5-step process, as you could translate Teshuvah as reconciliation, but it cannot, it is a promise of reconciliation, but only if we go through these steps together, whether it's interpersonally, you know, in our families, our cities, and in the nation in different ways. Reconciliation is not a term that people on the harmed end, you know, who have suffered the injury, will relate to until there is the clear acts of reparations are self-evident.
Does the tradition say that these steps of Teshuvah, that they need to happen in order? Can you do some without the other, or can you skip a step?
I don't think you can skip a step, no. You know, it's not linear in terms of geography and time. And it may be that you are able to do a symbolic act like tear down a Confederate statue and replace it with a meaningful historical monument. So we should think, you know, in an interdisciplinary, global, and multifaceted way about this. But 5 steps are needed, because otherwise the harm will be repeated. 5 steps are needed or the harm will be repeated. If there are no guarantees of non-repeat put in place as part of the infrastructure of systemic change, that harm will reoccur. As we learned from what happened in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and the massive increase in carceral rates. It's patchwork. Well, it's a quilt. It's kind of a quilt. Create spaces, you know, more spaces. If we create more of these, maybe micro environments of Teshuvah, micro environments of reparations, and they start to connect like a web, and there's all this movement building happening, the tides will turn.
Well, I'd like to ask if there are any final questions, and perhaps if you have a final message or blessing for us for Rosh Hashanah.
I would sing. Is that a blue shofar?
It is. It's a
wow.
glass.
I would say, wow, that's amazing. Because in a way we need. I love that a non-animal based shofar. That's beautiful. I have mine, which I received from Zelig Blumenthal, a Sofer, in 1974. This is a long time ago. But since that time, I have not bought a shofar. So I'm glad to see. I would love to hear you blow the blue shofar and to pray that this year is indeed a year of emancipation from the oppressions that are around us, and that we are witness to a transformative period that allows compassion and justice and equity to flow fully into our world.
Can you hear that song?
Can you hear that song? Will you blow the shofar?
I think my dog went.
Tekiah. You're so beautiful. Shechianu, that's the first time I've heard a non-animal shofar. It's beautiful symbol for the future.
Thank you, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, for being our guest. I want to appreciate everyone who made time for this evening and encourage you to come next week to hear from Rebecca Pierce and to be part of the events of October. with Rabbi Eilberg and Dr. Clarence Jones. And yeah, just immensely grateful to you, my teacher, and to the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice for helping lift us up with such words of inspiration.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
I'm going to stay on to talk